Right, it's time to talk science and tech, and we're moving into the area of neuroscience specifically today as we welcome to the studio Ruth Forster, who is a PhD candidate in neuroscience at the University of Cape Town. And if you're scratching your head going, what is that exactly? Don't worry, because I'm going to ask her to explain in just a minute. But the important thing for this conversation is that you know that Ruth is actually a theatre person by training. She was previously a theatre director and teacher here in South Africa and in the UK. And she is fascinated by our interpersonal relationships and the way we relate to one another in our families, between partners, between colleagues in the workplace, and looking at how theatre can be brought into that field to help us perhaps learn to improve the way we tackle those relationships. Ruth, it's great to have you with us in studio. Welcome.
Thank you, Pippa. Lovely to be here.
Let's start with the Dummy's Guide to Neuroscience. Would you mind just sort of setting a broad picture for us of what the field is actually all about?
Sure. So neuroscience is the brain, and it's all and everything about the brain, and that's very wide. So my field is social neuroscience, so that's specifically what's happening in the brain-body system within and between people.
Okay.
Yeah. But you've got the whole gamut. The unit that I sit in specializes in schizophrenia and bipolar. You go into every little facet, and having now I'm in my third year of neuroscience. The brain is an endlessly intricate, fascinating, constantly evolving in research field.
I mean, it's such a broad field, as you say, because the more we learn about it, the more we realize that this interconnectedness between what's going on in the brain and how that plays out in the body and vice versa, and impacts on absolutely every aspect of our lives. Now, I mentioned you've got this very strong background in theatre, but you have in recent years shifted those skills off the stage and into more sort of corporate space, looking at coaching and mentoring and how you develop those interpersonal skills. What led to that sort of shift in focus?
Yes, so theatre is all relational, and it's mapping relational dynamics between people on stage. And you do deep processes of self-awareness so that an actor understands what's their perspective lens, what's their reactivity profile, so that they don't impose it onto a character when they're developing a character. And I loved the work of rehearsal and was always fascinated by the personal growth that my performers would go through in the rehearsal process. And so after many years, 15 years in the theatre, I began to take adapted character development processes into the public and corporate sector to develop self-awareness and empathy in individuals and teams.
Okay, because when somebody hears the term sort of theatre and neuroscience, they're probably going, what on earth do those two have to do with each other? Are you going to make people stand up on stage and speak sonnets or practice a role? It sounds to me like it's the sort of the backstory of character development in theatre rather than what's happening on stage.
Absolutely. It's so indeed, when I was introduced to the field of neuroscience, for me it was like discovering the science behind what we do in theatre practice. And that's why it was so exciting for me. And the intervention that people undergo, which is a 6-week program, is made up of adapted character development processes that give you insight into your own self, into often juxtaposing different aspects of yourself, what moves them out of balance, what brings them back into balance. It looks at your relational reactivity, what triggers you, what kind of context and dynamics. And you would do this in a play, in a film too. But in this case, we do a deep dive into what happens physiologically, what happens emotionally, what happens mentally, what are those corresponding points. We look at a self-regulation exercise, which in theatre practice, that's different from theatre practice. So it's made up of character development exercises, embodied attunement exercises, and interpersonal theory. Because my journey since theatre meant that I facilitated a lot with people in different contexts. I then upskilled in interpersonal neurobiology, social psychology, became an accredited mediator, and then put all of that together and created this 6-week program.
Which you are now developing as part of your PhD.
So the program is fully developed.
Okay.
It developed in 2016, and what we're doing in the PhD is testing the neurobiological markers of it. And by that I mean what is happening in the brain and the body. So we're making the program evidence-based. And we measure you before the intervention, we measure you after the intervention, and we measure what are the changes in your emotion processing, what are the changes in the brain in self-awareness and in emotion regulation before and after.
I'm guessing a lot of people are wondering, how on earth do you measure emotion? How do you measure that kind of thing?
So emotion processing, we measure through the brain and the heart. And we measure it, in my case, we're using what's called electroencephalography, or in short, EEG. Mm-hmm. And it's if you've seen the skull cap with non-invasive electrodes. So we measure the brain activity across the scalp while you're doing tasks at the computer. And then we measure heart rate variability. And heart rate variability gives us the interplay of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So it gives us the interplay of our autonomic nervous system and how they work together. And a healthy autonomic nervous system to self-regulate will have a very fast interplay between your sympathetic, so your innovating, energizing part of the nervous system, and your parasympathetic, your calming. Parasympathetic nervous system is also very much involved in social bonding. So as our social system has become more complex, we've actually developed many, many years ago now, but it's the newest part of our nervous system, which seeks out, through our higher order brain structures, it seeks out risk and safety. So we're constantly assessing everything for risk and safety so that we can flourish.
This might be a bit of a sidebar, but there are some individuals who thrive on the risk and actively seek it out. Others shun it, avoid it at all costs. Do we know what's going on in the brain or previous life experience to inform that which one of the two you become?
So, risk in different situations is different. I mean, for myself, give me any people, and I'm having a field day. But ask me to do bungee jumping, not a chance. So we have different risk profiles in different areas. And certainly your reactivity profile is based on your early experiences and what's formed your neurobiology. And what this process does is it's a deep dive into becoming attuned to and aware of what's formed, what are the early patterning from your early caregivers that has formed your reactivity that you might be inserting into your current relationships. And remember, I'm really focused on relational. That's my expertise. That's my deep dive into neuroscience. And it's looking at really becoming attuned to that, so you know how to look after yourself, how to prepare yourself for challenging conversations, challenging relationships, and even relationships, with your spouse, the times that it gets tricky. What's happening to you? Why is it happening to you? What might you be bringing from old and imposing onto? What happens to you physiologically? What's the mental thought that corresponds, that sends you into a spin? Do you fight? Do you flight? Do you freeze? So you get all of that attunement and then learn how to regulate.
You're asking for a huge amount of self-awareness here because, there are not many people who have those highly developed skills to be able to recognize that in themselves and say, I can feel myself responding and getting angry, for example, at that thing you've just said, and you probably have no idea why. And to be able to go, why am I responding like this? Is it because of X experience in my past? How can I retune myself? Is that the level of sort of self-consciousness you are wanting to help people get to, they can
yes, that's the level of self-awareness that I take people through. So we did a pilot, which was very successful, and participants came away with a real understanding of their own reactivity, because you can only work with yourself. So they were able to adjust relationships with work colleagues, challenging work colleagues, and that tends to be a very challenging space. And they were able to assert boundaries, but with kindness. They were able to preempt where they would get reactive at home. So with toddlers and with teenagers, we had quite a growth. And then with spouses, there are times where your spouse does something and it just sends you up the roof, but you don't always know why, and you're unaware, and you've already what Daniel Siegel calls flipped your lid. So you've flipped out of your cognitive structures that are about reasoning and thinking, and you're only in your deeper emotional structures. And when you're in those structures, there's no ways you can reason, which is why it often takes us about 20 minutes before the lid goes back online and we can reason and we go, oh my goodness, what did I say? And maybe I went a little bit too far, etc., etc. So it's a real attunement to that. And we also practice, and here in week 5, we do role play but you're not acting, you're being you. And we role play because by this point you know what your core trigger is, you're attuned to how you respond, and you know how to self-regulate. And we practice in that week being triggered and intercepting it with a regulation strategy so that you can stay regulated. And the improvements are really exciting.
Can you give us a few examples of some of the core triggers that you've encountered? What might be an example of a core trigger?
So, for example, a core trigger. One woman would get home from work. She'd be home from work first, and her partner would arrive home, and he'd go sort of mutter hi and go straight and put his headphones on and start listening to music. She would become irate, and she wouldn't say anything. It'd go on for days, then she'd explode, and then we'd have a repeat. She never understood what was happening. And in her early caregiving environment, through various exercises, she understood that she wasn't seen. She was quite invisible, and she felt unseen. So when her partner did this, it triggered this. He wasn't meaning that. They have a wonderful relationship. He just needed to come home from work and kind of decompress with his music. So once she understood, she was able to explain to him what was happening. The power of the whole music thing totally lost its hold. You know, it didn't bother her anymore because she understood what's going on. And he made more of an effort to go, hang on, she needs me to connect first for a minute. Then I can go do my thing, and then we'll connect again. So that was one example. Another example is there's a wonderful thing in neuroscience called predictive encoding. And here, Pippa, which is quite scary, we really do take our early influences and how that's formed our wiring, and we impose that. That's our perspective lens. That's our gaze on the world, which is why we're often getting things wrong between ourselves all the time, between each other. And this woman, also again, good marriage and a strong high corporate profile, would come home, and when she would go on trips away, if she'd need to get her partner to organize lifts, etc., she'd become in quite a state. So this scenario, she wanted her husband to take her 16-year-old son to karate practice because it was quite important. She was going to ask him to take him. And she was so anticipating a no that as she walked in the door, all of us, the entire group, saw her dry mouth, her sort of collapsing in on herself, and being triggered before she'd even opened her mouth. Once we brought an awareness, we helped her to regulate. She regulated, and we gave her a B plan because we worked out what was going on in her head. And what was going on in her head was it was going to be, her needs wouldn't be met. And she was able to have a conversation where she said to her husband, can you take our son to whatever? He said, I can't. In the first round, she couldn't even ask why. In this round, she said, why? He said, I've got a 5 o'clock meeting. She said, could you organize an Uber? He said, of course. If you're happy, I'm happy. But what would have happened before was she would have got into a state. They would have had an argument. He doesn't understand what's going on. She doesn't understand what's going on. And so often with our closest, the misunderstandings are because of what's wired into our neurobiology that we're unaware of.
It's a fascinating field. I could talk to you for hours, Ruth, but I'm mindful of the fact that we must tell our audience members a little bit more about how to get involved in this study, because one of the reasons you're here today is to say, I'm still recruiting for people to come and join the study. So yes. Who and what are you looking for?
Wonderful. Thanks, Pippa. So I'm looking for a healthy population, or that's actually the wrong word, a non-clinical population, people from the ages of 25 to 60 who are not on any chronic medication. So that could be for diabetes, it could be antidepressants, and who are not doing a regular embodied practice. That could be a breathing practice, that could be yoga, that could be daily self-reflective journaling. And it's a 6-week program that runs once a week in the evening for 2 hours from 6:30 to 8:30. We're starting in March 9th. I'm running 5 groups in total. The first 2 are starting March 9th and March 10th. Can I
keep going? What will happen to someone who signs up for this?
Okay,
what will they experience?
If you contact me on my email, which I'll give you at the end, I will send you the information. And then you come to an information session in which I take you through exactly what I'll be doing in the intervention. You also go through a post-traumatic stress disorder scale for civilians. It's just 6 questions. What that does is it looks at, are you carrying overly stressful events that might still need to be processed? If you're over the threshold, that does exclude you.
Okay.
So it's a very rigorous process. You come, you sign the consent form, and then you're on. And what happens then is you come before the intervention for an hour and a quarter, and we record your brain and your heart and your respiration, your breathing, while you're doing 2 simple tasks at a computer to do with self-awareness and emotion regulation. Then you go through the 6-week program. Then we record your data again at the end of that, and then 6 weeks after that. You also have a semi-structured individual interview to look at the changes in your relational health.
It's fascinating. I'm intrigued to hear and see what kind of outcome you're going to get. I mean, you've done a pilot study already. What have you noticed? What sort of changes have you seen?
So participants, so it's wonderful to see the changes through the 6-week process, and they really start to take place after, from week 3. And participants really reported there were a range of things, being able to talk to, we're adult people. The average age was, I had one 25-year-old, the rest was between 33 and 50. So I'd say the average age was late 30s, early 40s. Talking to a parent for the first time, having a real conversation with their parent where they weren't becoming triggered. I had a couple who were able to share with each other more, really be aware of each other's, what's forming each other, what's going on for each other. A lot of people who are able to manage the workplace better. Again, placing boundaries, having difficult conversations, talking to bosses, not taking on stuff that they would usually take on, self-regulating, a lot of self-regulation. I had a participant with a toddler and a participant with a teenager. Both of them kept blowing up, able to regulate themselves so that they could connect better with their children. So a real range. We did behavioral questionnaires. We didn't do the neurobiological. We did psychological questionnaires and scales and semi-structured interviews. And the behavioral questionnaires showed changes in self-awareness, in acting with observing what's going on in you, not judging, self-regulation, self-kindness, compassion.
We all need a lot of that. So I'm really excited to hear about this. Quick question before we must wrap and share your contact details. Somebody's asking when your last group will start. So I'm guessing maybe 9 and 10 March is too early for them. How
yes,
late
so the
are you
next
going to
2
start?
groups are 4th and 5th of May. So I have 8 people per group. So it's an intimate process, and that's what I can hold. And so I run 4 groups, 2 in March, 2 starting in May. And I also run a group of 16 who'll only do what's called the Golden Nugget Listening Breathing exercise. That's the self-regulation tool to disentangle the effects of that exercise from the rest of the intervention.
Right. If our listeners think I want to be part of those 8 or those 16, how do they get in touch with you, Ruth?
Contact me on lvnrut002@myuct.ac.za.
And if you're driving and you couldn't jot that down, please feel free to drop me an email whenever it's convenient for you, and I'll gladly connect you with Ruth directly. You've been listening to Ruth Levine Forster, PhD candidate in neuroscience at the University of Cape Town. Fascinating conversation, Ruth. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pippa.